The story really starts the night before. I was reading a portion of scripture when Paul's talking about the need for the church leaders not to hide the truth. Because if that gospel, if that truth was veiled or hidden, it was hidden to those who are perishing, to those who are hurting, to those who are being damaged by their deviant sexuality. And those words, really pierced my heart. And so just then and there, I got out one of my shirts. It wasn't anything special. It was just a black Ezekiel shirt, and I put some masking tape on it and took some Sharpie and penned the words I wrote. Be ashamed, our school has embraced what God has condemned. And on the back, an excerpt from Romans 1:27 that says homosexuality is shameful. Just to put the truth out there. I'll take some crap for a couple days for the truth to be in this conversation. The school opened up the conversation, and it's supposed to be a marketplace for ideas. So I decided just to put it out there. And I had no idea that I would be suspended, threatened with expulsion, and questioned by an armed sheriff. That's just not what I thought the day had in store for me. My teachers saw the shirt and basically said, "Hey, you can't have that. You either need to remove the tape from the shirt or you can go talk to one of the administrators." And I asked him why, and he said, you just either need to go to the office or take the tape off.
So the teacher's first thought was, this is disrupting the teaching process that I'm engaged in. I need to remove the T-shirt. Then she thought about it for a moment and concluded that it went farther than just disruption, that it actually violated the rights of others.
What marginalizes me, especially that type of language, due to the fact that you're telling me my lifestyle and who I am as a person is inferior to yours.
And they said, "Look, Chase, you just can't wear this here. You can't do that. You can't, retain your rights of free speech in this way. It's offensive." Since when has speech that is merely offensive been censored on that basis alone?
At the end of the day, when you look at it as a culture, especially with the gay youth culture, you look at the suicide rate. And that really says it all. When you've got such a high suicide rate with gay teens in America today, obviously they are feeling marginalized and they are feeling like they're less than. And little acts like that can add to a bigger whole.
Political correctness is definitely infringing upon the free speech rights of many individuals throughout society.
The most impactful moment of that whole day is when I went to talk with the vice principal. He called me into his office and he sat me down and he stared across the table and started talking to me. And about halfway through the conversation, he looked me in the eyes and said, "If your faith is offensive, you have to leave it in the car." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. If my faith was offensive, are we in the United States?
And incidentally, nobody ever complained about Chase's T-shirt. No student. They haven't been able to introduce any evidence that indicated that a student was even offended by his T-shirt. But nevertheless, the school censored it.
Where does all that hatred start? It can start from the most basic of areas, such as a T-shirt.
He was wearing an extremely confrontational, very ugly T-shirt. I think schools can regulate that time and place and manner to a much greater extent than government can the citizenry.
This is the kind of case that the student has to win, because if not, then free speech is really worth nothing in America's high schools.
The classic case that established this precedent is Tinker versus Des Moines, where Mary Beth Tinker wore an armband into school to protest the war in Vietnam. The court held that she has a right to express her political views, and that right is only limited by disruption of the educational process.
Students have free speech rights. Free speech rights of students are constantly being circumscribed.
These are just kids. What do they have to contribute to the marketplace and ideas and opinions?
Today, a U.S. judge agreed, ruling that the district's policy against hate speech is within the law.
To this day, Poway High School will not allow speech on their campus that they feel like is offensive to students.
One of the bummers for some people about protecting free speech and the marketplace of ideas is that people get offended, and that's the price of liberty. We don't have the right to not be offended.
For your information, the Supreme Court has roundly rejected prior restraint.
This is not a First Amendment thing, man.
If you don't calm down, I'm going to have to ask you to leave.
Lady, I got buddies who died face down in the muck so that you and I could enjoy this family restaurant.
All right, I'm out of here.
Hey, dude, don't go away, man. Come on, this affects all of us, man.
This is a different kind of war, and there are great stakes in the balance.
In the 60s, I met Dan Ellsberg during a march against the Vietnam War. Dan Ellsberg then was a hawk. He was involved with the American government, and he believed that what we were doing in Vietnam was absolutely right. Dan was running up and down hills with a machine gun, firing at the Vietnamese. So when he and I had a discussion about the Vietnam War or about the Peace March, he really tended to treat me as an idiot, communist, lefty, whatever. He absolutely had no respect for the people who were marching against the war. He saw it as un-American and unpatriotic. But it's absolutely clear that Dan had a great zest for battle. There were parts of Dan that were very self-destructive. You wouldn't have had the Pentagon Papers unless you had somebody who was willing to put his life at risk. The Pentagon Papers were massive. It was a study that had been done at the government's request by Rand, and the study was to look back at America's history with Vietnam, and to some extent to try and figure out why we were there.
The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north into the south.
It's a little bit odd when you think of it, that in the middle of a war, the Secretary of Defense has to find out why we're in the war. And a few people had access to it, not many. One of them, named Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on one of the chapters, had had an epiphany.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else.
Pentagon Papers shows that rather than us being dragged into something that we didn't want to be dragged into, we in fact precipitated it, and we precipitated the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and then we lied about it.
I felt that as an American citizen, as a responsible citizen, I could no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American public. You can no longer cooperate, I'm sorry? I can no longer cooperate in concealing this information from the American
And the Pentagon Papers, which were classified and were top secret, were, Dan thought, so explosive that reading them would cause a stop of the Vietnam War. So many copies were made so that if the government would get one copy, that another copy would be released. While the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune were deciding whether or not to publish the Pentagon Papers, a copy of the documents were put in my house in Woodstock. The FBI would occasionally stop by Woodstock. They'd be standing outside in a car, parked on the hill. And also, I believe that we had our phones tapped. I knew that these were classified documents. It was no joke. There was a great deal of concern on behalf of everybody as to exactly what they would charge you with. If it in fact turned out that there was stuff there that would damage American troops, which is what we knew the government would claim, I could have faced the same penalties as Dan because I was involved in it. So I realized I was placing myself in some danger, just starting a family.
Dad, you had kids at the time. You had us. Were you concerned about not being there for us?
I never took those two things and put them one against the other. Clearly, if I had not been there for 99 years, I would not have been there for my children. But I think that the act that was done would form some kind of a bond. One Saturday evening, we saw the early edition of the Times. It was going to come out Sunday. And there it was on the front page, the Pentagon Papers. I was astonished. Neither Dan nor I knew that the Times was going to publish those papers. And the reason the Times didn't tell anybody was they were afraid if anybody knew, somehow the government would learn and stop it.
Good evening. At this moment, we are awaiting a decision by the Supreme Court of the United States on one of the most fundamental questions ever to come before the court.
The Times' lawyers told them that they would not represent them in that matter. So the Times found themselves, as one writer later put it, like a vicar found in a house of ill repute at midnight without lawyers. And they asked me, and they asked a professor of mine from Yale Law School, Alexander Bickel, who would become chief counsel in the case.
The newspaper editors decided that the national interest would be served by publication of the documents, and that under the First Amendment to the Constitution, the government had no right to prevent publication. The government disagreed, and for the first time in our history as a nation, went to court to prevent the papers from publishing the rest of the material in their possession.
The hardest moment in the Pentagon Papers case came when Justice Potter Stewart turned to Professor Bickel in the argument.
Now, Mr. Bickel, let me give you a hypothetical case. Let us assume that when the members of the court go back and open up this sealed record, we find something there that absolutely convinces us that its disclosure result in the sentencing to death of 100 young men. What should we do?
It's what we lawyers think of as a killer question. You know what you want to say, you know what you have to say, and they sometimes differ. Professor Bickel tried to dodge. He said, I'm sure you won't find that when you get back. No, said Stewart. Assume that that's what we find. And Bickel said again, well, I'm asking you, suppose we find that.
Most of us would say, you would say the Constitution requires that it be published and that these men die. Is that it?
No, I'm afraid I have. I'm afraid that the inclinations of humanity overcome the somewhat more abstract devotion to the First Amendment.
Had he said, in effect, he has to die for the First Amendment, the court would have recoiled. We would have died in the case because it just sounds wrong. And that's why eventually, I believe, he was right to give the answer, dangerous as it was, that he gave. That was a great First Amendment victory.
We will resume the series on the Vietnam Papers exactly as we had planned before the injunction.
The lies that are embedded in the Pentagon Papers are lies that did not have hypothetical consequences. 55,000 Americans lost their lives because of those lies by American officials to the president and to the public, and by the president to the public.
So I think that the Pentagon Papers should stand for the extent of government lying. That's why the First Amendment is so important. At the end of the day, it's very difficult to be skeptical of your government. And it's very difficult to be skeptical of the extent of which the government will lie, whether it be to go to an Iraq war or to justify development of oil fields. It's very difficult to believe that the people that we have elected will act in a way that is so harmful, and they really will not let the American population know.
New York City lives on orange alert every day. The level has never gone down. New York City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly recently shared his bird's eye view. You've got millions of people coming into this city on a daily basis. So how do you weigh allowing the city to continue operating, yet at the same time protecting these people who are coming here for this high-profile event?
We can't close the city down. We have to focus on keeping it functioning and doing everything we reasonably can do to protect it.
City hospitals are preparing, too, for a possible chemical or biological attack.
There are still no specific threats against next week's convention.
But in a city known to be at the top of Al-Qaeda's target list, officials here are leaving nothing to chance.
A political convention is like nothing else in American politics. It's the time when everybody comes out. It's not just for the Republicans at their convention to be able to express their views by nominating their candidate. It's for all Americans to be able to voice their opinions about what's going on in our country and the policies of the day. And when the policies are controversial, well, that's when people take to the streets.
The